Hi guys, and welcome back to the Slumbering Times. Picture this. You're standing in a valley so scorched by the sun that even the rocks seem to be begging for mercy, surrounded by the carved out tombs of dead god kings who, let's be honest, probably had better interior decorators than you or I could ever afford. It's 1922. The world is barely recovered from a war that killed millions. And somewhere beneath your feet lies a teenage pharaoh who's been having the longest nap in recorded history. 3,000 years undisturbed. No alarm clocks, no Monday mornings, just eternal rest surrounded by more gold than a rapper's fever dream. Now, here's the question that should keep you up tonight, or hopefully not in this video's case. What possesses a man to spend years digging holes in Egyptian deserts on the off chance they might find something spectacular? And not just any person, but a somewhat prickly, socially awkward British man with a moustache that could double as a bottle brush, who'd already been fired from one archaeological gig for, and I cannot stress this enough, defending Egyptian workers against drunk French tourists. Howard Carter wasn't supposed to be the hero of this story. He had no university degree, no aristocratic pedigree, no charming personality to schmooze wealthy patrons at garden parties. He was, by all accounts, the kind of person you'd politely avoid at a dinner party, because you just know he's going to corner you and talk about pottery shards for 45 minutes. And yet, this gloriously stubborn man found the only virtually intact royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, cracked open a time capsule that had been sealed since the Bronze Age collapsed, and gave the world a golden mask so iconic that it's now more recognizable than most living celebrities. So buckle up, or rather settle in, and let your eyelids grow heavy, because we're about to excavate the story of Howard Carter, a man who proved that sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't made by the brightest or the best connected, but by the most relentlessly, magnificently stubborn. Before we meet our protagonist properly, we need to understand the world that he was about to shake. The early 1920s were a peculiar time, a moment suspended between trauma and jubilation, like that awkward pause after someone tells a joke at a funeral and you're not sure if it's okay to laugh. World War I had just ended, leaving Europe a patchwork of grief, economic exhaustion, and a desperate hunger for anything that wasn't about trenches, gas attacks, or the approximately 17 million reasons to despair for humanity. People wanted escapism. They wanted wonder. They wanted to believe that somewhere, somehow, there was still magic left in the world, even if that magic came in the form of very old, very dead people who'd been considerate enough to get buried with extraordinary amounts of bling. Egypt in 1922 was itself caught in a fascinating contradiction. Technically still under British colonial control, the country was simultaneously experiencing a surge of nationalist fervour. The 1919 revolution had shaken the colonial establishment, and by 1922, Egypt would gain nominal independence. Nominal, of course, being the operative word. Rather like being told you're a grown-up who can make your own decisions, except your parents still control your bank account and insist on approving your friends. The Valley of the Kings, that desolate, sun-blasted canyon in the west bank of the Nile, had been the royal necropolis of choice during Egypt's New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BC. For nearly 500 years, pharaohs had been tucked into the valley's rock-cut tombs, surrounded by everything they'd need for the afterlife. Furniture, food, clothing, chariots, and enough gold to make a dragon envious. By Carter's time, however, the valley had been thoroughly ransacked. Ancient tomb robbers, arguably Egypt's most consistent profession across millennia, had plundered most of the tombs within a generation of their sealing. Later treasure hunters, archaeologists with varying degrees of ethics, and tourists with sticky fingers had picked over what remained. The general consensus among experts was clear. The Valley of the Kings was done. Finished. A greatest hits album with all the tracks already ripped. But here's where it gets interesting. Among the 60-odd tombs discovered in the valley, one tiny pharaoh's name kept appearing in fragments. Random objects, bits of pottery, tantalizing references that suggested he'd been buried somewhere. His name was Tutankhamun, and by ancient Egyptian standards, he was approximately as important as a mid-level regional manager at a moderately successful papyrus concern. Howard Carter was born on May 9th, 1874 in Kensington, London, which at the time was experiencing the full Victorian treatment. Coal smoke, social stratification so rigid you could use it as a ruler, and a firmly held belief that the sun never set on the British Empire because God wouldn't trust the British in the dark. He was the youngest of 11 children, 11, which even by Victorian standards suggests his parents either really loved children or had a fundamental misunderstanding of how to prevent them. His father, Samuel John Carter, was a modestly successful artist who specialized in painting animals, particularly the horses and dogs of wealthy patrons. This gave young Howard two things: an eye for detail and observation, and a particular sort of class anxiety that comes from being close enough to wealth to smell it, but not close enough to own any. Howard was a sickly child, which in Victorian England was about as common as rain, but no less concerning. Frequent illnesses meant limited formal schooling, so he was largely educated at home, spending his time in rural Norfolk with relatives. Picture a pale, thin boy with large eyes, lying in fields sketching birds and flowers, while other children played more vigorous games that his constitution couldn't tolerate. It's the origin story of either an artist or a supervillain, really. And the jury was arguably still out even when he was an adult. What he lacked in health and formal education, Carter made up for in three qualities: an almost supernatural ability to draw, a memory for visual details that bordered on the obsessive, and, this cannot be overstated, the stubbornness of a mule that's decided it simply will not be moving today. Thank you very much. His father recognized the artistic talent and trained Howard in the family trade. By his teens, Carter was a skilled draftsman, capable of rendering animals and scenes with remarkable precision. This skill, seemingly destined to keep him comfortably provincial, would instead become his unlikely ticket to Egypt. The late 19th century was experiencing peak Egyptomania, that peculiar European obsession with ancient Egypt that treated an entire civilization as a sort of exotic theme park for imperialist nostalgia. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 had included scholars who documented monuments and sparked widespread fascination. The deciphering of the Rosetta Stone by Jean-François Champollion and in 1822 had finally unlocked hieroglyphics, making ancient texts readable again after 15 centuries of silence. By Carter's youth, ancient Egypt had become the Victorian equivalent of a blockbuster franchise. Everyone wanted a piece of it, preferably a piece they could ship back to London and put in a museum. In 1891, when Carter was just 17 and presumably still figuring out how to grow a proper Victorian moustache, opportunity knocked. Lord Amherst, a family friend and antiquities collector, needed an artist to trace Egyptian tomb drawings for the Egypt Exploration Fund. Percy Newberry, an Egyptologist, selected young Howard based on his portfolio. And just like that, a sickly boy who'd barely left Norfolk found himself boarding a ship to Egypt. Imagine stepping off a boat in Alexandria in 1891 as a 17-year-old who'd spent most of his life in the grey, damp embrace of England. The assault on the senses alone would have been extraordinary. The brilliant, aggressive sunlight, the heat that doesn't just warm but occupies space, filling your lungs like a living thing. The cacophony of a port city where Arabic, Italian, Greek, French and English collided in a commercial Babel. The smells of spices, sweat, animals, and the ever-present dust that the Egyptian winds carry like an ancient calling card. For Carter, who'd spent his childhood sketching the gentle English countryside, Egypt must have felt like landing on another planet, one where the monuments were bigger, the history was older, and the sense of the past's proximity was almost overwhelming. His first assignment took him to Middle Egypt, to the rock-cut tombs at Beni Hassan, where he would trace the wall paintings, scenes of daily life from the Middle Kingdom, nearly 4,000 years old. Carter worked meticulously, his artistic training serving him perfectly as he recorded wrestlers, hunters, and farmers frozen in pigmented eternity. But something happened to Carter in those tombs. Beyond the artistic challenge, beyond the scholarly interest, he felt something that would define the rest of his life. A connection. A sense that these weren't just paintings or historical data points, but voices. Silent now, yes, but voices nonetheless, of artists, workers, priests, and kings who'd walked this same dust, felt this same sun, and tried to make something that would last. He was hooked, completely, irrevocably hooked. Over the next several years, Carter's role evolved. He wasn't just an artist anymore, he was becoming an archaeologist, learning on the job in the way most Victorian-era archaeologists did, through trial, error, and the patient mentorship of those who'd made the same mistakes slightly earlier. He worked under Flinders Petrie, the father of scientific archaeology in Egypt, who insisted on methodical recording, stratigraphic analysis, and treating small finds with the same respect as gold treasures. Revolutionary concepts when many archaeologists were essentially treasure hunters with better credentials. Petrie was notoriously eccentric, working in the desert in his pink underwear, eating canned food directly from the tin, living in tombs to save money. Carter, who had his own antisocial tendencies and preferred cats to most people, found this environment oddly comfortable. He learned to excavate properly, to document, to read the language of broken pottery and disturbed soil. By his late 20s, Carter had become Inspector General of Monuments for Upper Egypt, based in Luxor, a significant position that put him in charge of protecting and excavating the monuments of Thebes and the Valley of the Kings. He was living in Egypt full-time now, a thin, intense figure, with his signature bow tie, surrounded by his cats and his obsessions, spending his days among the dead and finding them infinitely preferable to dinner parties. He had, by all accounts, the social skills of a particularly irritable cactus, but he understood ancient Egypt, really understood it, in a way that transcended academic credentials. He could read a tomb not just as an architectural space, but as a last message, a final defiant shout across the millennia that said, "I was here. I mattered. Remember me." But this is where our hero's story takes a rather inglorious turn, the kind that reminds us that the path to the legendary discovery is often paved with spectacularly awkward missteps. In 1905, Carter was stationed at Saqqara, the vast necropolis near Cairo, dominated by the stepped pyramid of Djoser. His job included supervising the tourist sites, which in the early 20th century meant managing the delicate balance between foreign visitors who wanted to gawk at ancient wonders and Egyptian guards who were understandably protective of their heritage and tired of being treated as invisible servants by colonial tourists. One day, a group of French tourists decided they didn't need to follow the rules. Specifically, they wanted to enter a site without paying or showing proper documentation. The guards refused entry. The French tourists, displaying that particular brand of colonial entitlement that ate about as well as milk in the desert sun, became aggressive. Carter arrived to find the situation escalating, and here Carter did something that was either remarkably principled or catastrophically stupid, depending on your perspective. He sided with the Egyptian guards. Not diplomatically, not quietly. He sided with them loudly and refused to overrule them, insisting the French tourists followed the proper procedures. When the French visitors complained to their consul, the situation became an international incident. Minor by global standards, but major enough to require someone to take the fall. That someone was Carter. The French authorities demanded an apology. The British authorities, eager to smooth things over with an ally, pressured Carter to apologize. And Carter, displaying the diplomatic flexibility of a granite obelisk, refused. Not because he didn't understand the political ramifications, not because he didn't recognize that his career was on the line, but because he was right, damn it, and the Egyptian workers were owed respect, and some principles mattered more than career advancement. The British administration, faced with a subordinate who simply would not bend, had no choice but to remove him from his position. In 1905, Howard Carter, former Inspector General, accomplished archaeologist, expert on the Valley of the Kings, found himself effectively unemployed, his reputation damaged, his career seemingly over. He was 31 years old. For the next several years, Carter scraped by on odd jobs, dealing in antiquities, legally, though the line was blurrier then, painting watercolors for tourists, doing occasional guiding work. He lived mostly in a small house near the Valley of the Kings, a stubborn, prideful man watching lesser talents receive funding and recognition, while he languished in professional exile. It was, by any reasonable measure, a disaster. But here's the thing about disasters. Sometimes they're just a setup for what comes next. Because in 1907, a wealthy English aristocrat with too much time, too much money, and a doctor's recommendation to winter in Egypt for his health, was about to need an expert on Egyptian antiquities. His name was George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, and everything was about to change. Lord Carnarvon was, in many ways, Carter's opposite. Charming where Carter was prickly, wealthy where Carter was poor, well-connected where Carter was isolated. He'd come to Egypt as a dilettante, a hobbyist collector looking for amusement in the land of the Pharaohs. He needed an expert to guide his archaeological interests. Carter needed a patron who wouldn't ask him to apologize for having principles. When Gaston Maspero, director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, introduced them, it was less a meeting of minds than a perfect alignment of mutual need. Carnarvon had money and concessions to dig. Carter had expertise and an obsession with one particular corner of the Valley of the Kings. Together, they would search for a pharaoh so minor, so overlooked, that most experts thought he didn't even have a proper tomb. A boy king who'd died young, restored the old gods after his father's religious revolution, and been buried in the shadow of his more famous predecessors. His name was Tutankhamun, and he'd been waiting in the dark for 3,245 years. Part 2. An Unlikely Alliance, the Lord and the Loner. So let's talk about Lord Carnarvon for a moment. a man whose full name, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, sounds less like a person and more like a law firm that specialises in Victorian-era estate disputes. The 5th Earl of Carnarvon was everything Howard Carter wasn't. Wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice, socially graceful, educated at Eton and Cambridge, and possessed of the kind of effortless charm that made people want to give him things, which is really the ultimate aristocratic superpower. He lived at Highclere Castle. Yes, that Highclere Castle. The one you've seen if you've ever watched Downton Abbey. Because apparently even in death, Carnarvon couldn't escape being used for entertainment purposes. The estate sprawled across 5,000 acres of Hampshire countryside, featured more rooms than any reasonable person could count, and came with the sort of generational wealth that let you treat archaeology as a hobby rather than, you know, an actual job that paid the rent. But here's where our Earl becomes interesting. He was genuinely passionate about Egypt, not just as a status symbol or a source of cocktail party anecdotes, but as a serious intellectual pursuit. Granted, he came to this passion via the circuitous route of nearly killing himself in a motorcar accident in 1901, because rich Edwardians treated early automobiles as the modern tech bros treat cryptocurrency, with far more enthusiasm than wisdom. The accident left him with permanent health problems, particularly respiratory issues that made the damp British climate about as advisable as smoking in a fireworks factory. His doctors prescribed what Victorian medicine prescribed for everything: a change of air. Specifically the warm, dry air of Egypt, which had become the fashionable health resort for wealthy Europeans with lung problems and too much time on their hands. Carnarvon first arrived in Egypt in 1903, and like many wealthy tourists before him, found himself utterly captivated. But unlike the average visitor content with Nile cruises and hotel terraces, Carnarvon wanted to dig. He wanted to find things. He had, in essence, caught the archaeological bug, which, given Egypt's actual bug population, was probably not the only thing he caught. But I digress. There was just one small problem. Lord Carnarvon knew approximately nothing about actual archaeology. His early attempts at excavation were, by all accounts, the sort of enthusiastic disasters that made professional archaeologists wake up screaming. He hired workers, picked promising-looking spots based on what can only be described as vibes, and proceeded to discover, well, mostly sand, some pottery, a mummified cat here and there, the archaeological equivalent of browsing a clearance bin at a shop that's been picked over by everyone else for the past 3,000 years. By 1907, even Carnarvon recognised he needed professional help. Gaston Maspero, the French Egyptologist who ran the Egyptian Antiquities Service with the weary efficiency of a man trying to prevent every wealthy European from accidentally destroying priceless artifacts, suggested Howard Carter. It was an inspired bit of matchmaking, the sort of pairing that shouldn't have worked, but did, like peanut butter and pickles. Carter needed funding and access to excavation sites. Carnarvon needed someone who could tell a significant archaeological find from a rock that happened to look interesting after 3 genotonics. More importantly, they needed each other in ways that transcended the simple patron-expert relationship. Carnarvon, for all his wealth and connections, was an outsider to the established archaeological community, seen as a dilettante, a rich hobbyist playing at science. Carter, for all his expertise, was persona non grata among the same establishment, the prickly commoner who'd chosen Egyptian workers over French colonial pride. Together they formed a unit that was greater than its parts. Carnarvon's money and social protection combined with Carter's obsessive expertise and absolute refusal to suffer fools. Their partnership began modestly. Carter directed excavations at various sites in the Theban area, uncovering noble tombs and making respectable, if not spectacular, discoveries. They published their findings properly, Carter handling the technical work, Carnarvon footing the bills and lending his name to give the work legitimacy. But Carter had his eye on a bigger prize. Actually, a smaller prize, which is precisely what made it so elusive. Tutankhamun, or as he was known at the time, Tutankhamun, before a hasty religious rebrand, was the archaeological equivalent of that actor who appears in the background of one scene in a famous movie and then vanishes into obscurity. You know he existed because there's evidence, but good luck finding anything meaningful about him. Here's what Carter knew by 1914, when he'd become fixated on finding this particular needle in the world's sandiest haystack. Tutankhamun had ruled Egypt for approximately 9 or 10 years during the 18th dynasty, sometime around 1332 to 1323 BC. He'd become pharaoh at roughly 9 because apparently ancient Egypt looked at children and thought, you know what, this child should command armies and be worshipped as a living god. And died around age 18 or 19, possibly from malaria, possibly from a broken leg that went septic, possibly from the sheer exhaustion of being a teenage god king trying to clean up his father's theological mess. Ah yes, his father. That would be Akhenaten, possibly the most controversial pharaoh in Egyptian history. The man who looked at Egypt's robust pantheon of gods, accumulated over thousands of years, and decided, actually, no, we're doing monotheism now. Everyone worship the sun disk Aten. All those other gods? Cancelled. I'm talking to you, Amun-Ra, you overrated has-been. This went over about as well as you'd expect. Akhenaten's religious revolution disrupted the entire social and economic structure of Egypt, which was rather inconveniently built around temples to multiple gods. The priests weren't happy, the people weren't happy, the gods presumably weren't happy, though they maintained their traditional silence on the matter. When Akhenaten died, his son, originally named Tutankhamun, living image of Aten, inherited a theological dumpster fire. The boy king, or more likely his advisors, quickly pivoted, changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, and moved the capital back from Akhenaten's purpose-built city of Amarna to a traditional Thebes, and basically issued a divine apology tour. Our mistake, the official line went. The old gods are back. Please don't overthrow us. It was ancient Egypt's version of a corporate rebrand after a PR disaster, complete with hasty policy reversals and a desperate attempt to pretend the previous regime hadn't happened. Tut died young, possibly before he could father an heir, and was buried with appropriate honours, but without the grand tomb he would have had if he'd lived longer. Later pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, eager to distance themselves from the Amarna period heresy, systematically erased Akhenaten's family from official records. Tut's name was chiselled off monuments, his achievements were attributed to others. He became a historical footnote, a minor king overwhelmed by the deliberate amnesia of his successors. By Carter's time, Tutankhamun was known from scattered references and a handful of artifacts that kept turning up in the Valley of the Kings, tantalizing hints that he'd been buried somewhere in that royal metropolis, but no one knew where. Most Egyptologists assumed his tomb had been robbed in antiquity, or that it was too insignificant to bother searching for, or that it had been destroyed by later construction. Theodore Davis, an American lawyer and amateur archaeologist who'd held the excavation concession for the Valley of the Kings from 1902 to 1914, had found a pit containing pottery, linens, and other materials bearing Tutankhamun's name. Davis declared he'd found the king's tomb. Never mind that there was no actual tomb, no mummy, and no treasure. Close enough, he figured. In 1912, Davis famously declared, "I fear the Valley of the Kings is now exhausted." Howard Carter read that statement and thought, bollocks. But before Carter could pursue his obsession with the ghost pharaoh, the world decided to have what we will now euphemistically call the Great War, as if adding great to the title somehow makes the industrial-scale slaughter more palatable. World War I erupted in 1914, and even Egypt, technically neutral as an Ottoman vassal, but functionally under British control, couldn't escape the spillover. Britain formally declared Egypt a protectorate in 1914, deposing the Ottoman-friendly Khedive and installing a more compliant sultan. This was imperialism at its most brazen. "We know you're technically someone else's country, but we're going to run things now for your own good, and also because the Suez Canal is strategically vital to our global empire, and we'd rather not risk it falling into Ottoman hands. So, surprise! You're British now, sort of. Don't make a fuss." Archaeological work largely ground to a halt as able-bodied men enlisted or were conscripted. Funding dried up and everyone suddenly had more pressing concerns than dead pharaohs. Carter, too old for combat at 40 and not exactly the soldiering type anyway, spent the war years in various capacities. Some sources suggest intelligence work, others administrative roles. The details are frustratingly vague, which either means he was doing something genuinely secret or something so tediously bureaucratic that no one bothered recording it. What we do know is that he remained in Egypt and maintained his connection with Carnarvon, who spent part of the war convalescing at Highclere Castle and part of it continuing his Egyptian interests when he could. The war ended in November 1918, leaving Europe a graveyard and the world psychologically shattered. The Spanish flu pandemic, which killed more people than the war itself, possibly 50 million worldwide, added disease to the devastating mix. The old empires were collapsing. The Ottoman Empire was being carved up by the victors. The Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires had ceased to exist. And even the British and French empires, technically victorious, were showing cracks. Egypt emerged from the war changed. Egyptian soldiers and labourers had been conscripted to support the British war effort, hundreds of thousands of them sent to battlefields in Europe, the Middle East and elsewhere. They'd been promised, vaguely, that their service would be rewarded with greater autonomy. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. In 1919, when Saad Zaghloul and other Egyptian nationalists demanded independence and the British arrested and exiled them instead, Egypt exploded in revolution. Strikes, demonstrations and violence swept the country. Women participated in protests, an unprecedented public role. The British, stretched thin by war losses and facing nationalist movements across their empire, eventually conceded nominal independence in 1922, though they retained control over defence, foreign policy, communications and the Sudan. It was independence with so many asterisks attached that it barely qualified for the name. This was the Egypt that Carter and Carnarvon returned to in 1917 when they resumed their partnership. A country in transition, caught between colonial past and an uncertain future, where foreign archaeologists like themselves were increasingly viewed with suspicion. They weren't just digging up artifacts, they were participating in a system where Egypt's heritage was being removed to European museums, where foreign wealth and privilege dictated who could explore the country's past. Carter understood this tension better than most. His experience defending Egyptian workers in 1905 had shown him something many of his contemporaries missed. Egyptians weren't props in someone else's adventure story. They were real people with agency, dignity, and a rightful claim to their history. But understanding the tension and resolving it were two different things. Carter wanted to find Tutankhamun. He wanted it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. And in 1917, Lord Carnarvon secured the excavation concession for the Valley of the Kings. The search could finally begin. The Valley of the Kings, if you've never had the pleasure of standing in it during summer, is essentially a geological oven, a narrow winding gorge where the limestone cliffs trap heat like they're trying to win a competition. Temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. There's no shade, no water, no natural vegetation to speak of. It's the kind of place that makes you question the life choices that led you there, which is probably why the ancient Egyptians chose it for burials rather than, say, condominiums. By 1917, the valley was literally layered with history. 3,000 years of excavations, tomb construction, flash floods, and tourist visits had left it a jumbled archaeological mess. Debris from one excavation covered earlier work. Later tombs had been cut through earlier ones. Flash floods had filled some tombs with debris while revealing others. The valley floor had risen by several meters in places from accumulated rubble. Carter's approach was systematic to the point of obsession. He didn't just want to dig randomly. He wanted to excavate the entire valley floor down to bedrock in a methodical grid pattern, removing all post-ancient debris to see what lay beneath. It was archaeological brute force. Not elegant, not quick, but thorough. Imagine vacuuming your house, except the house is a rocky desert canyon. The vacuum is several dozen workers with hand tools, and you're looking for something that might not even exist, buried under centuries of rubble in temperatures that could cook an egg on your head. Now, imagine doing this for years. Carter divided the valley into sections and began the painstaking process. His team, dozens of Egyptian workers overseen by his race, foreman Ahmed Gerigar and later Hossein Abu Awad, moved ton after ton of limestone rubble, screening it for any artifacts, mapping everything, photographing constantly. Carter himself was present daily, a solitary figure in his signature bow tie despite the heat, examining every basket of rubble, every suspicious depression in the bedrock. The work was brutally hard. The workers laboured in conditions that would violate every modern safety regulation ever conceived. They lived in temporary camps, worked dawn till dusk, and modest wages by European standards, though Carter reportedly paid better than most archaeologists of his era, and dealt with the constant hazards of rockfalls, scorpions, and the occasional irritable cobra who'd taken up residence in a convenient tomb shaft. And they found nothing. Well, not nothing. They found debris, pottery shards, bits and pieces of the valley's long history, but no tomb, no Tutankhamun. Season after season, Carter returned. Winter 1917 to 18, nothing. 1918 to 19, nothing. 1919 to 1920, nothing. Each season cost Carnarvon thousands of pounds, money that was producing scholarly interest but no spectacular discovery, no justification for the expense. By 1922, they'd been searching for 5 years with nothing to show for it. Lord Carnarvon's patience, understandably, was wearing thin. He was wealthy, yes, but he wasn't printing money in his basement. The excavations cost roughly $2,000 per season, approximately $100,000 in today's money, or about $125,000 US. 5 years of that with no return on investment would make anyone reconsider their hobbies. In the summer of 1922, Carnarvon summoned Carter to Highclere Castle. The message was clear. This was likely the last season. If they didn't find something significant, the concession would be given up. Carter, displaying the negotiating skills that had served him so poorly in the past but were about to pay off spectacularly, made an offer. Let him fund one more season himself, give him one more chance to prove his theory right. It was either incredibly noble or incredibly stupid. Carter wasn't wealthy. Funding a season himself would strain his finances considerably. But it was also vintage Carter. Stubborn, convinced of his own rightness, and unwilling to let go. Carnarvon, moved by Carter's conviction, or possibly just worn down by his sheer persistence, agreed to fund one final season himself. But this was it, the last roll of the dice. Carter returned to Egypt in October 1922 with a singular focus. There was one area of the valley he hadn't fully excavated. A triangle of ground near the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VI, where ancient workmen's huts sat atop bedrock. Previous excavators had avoided it because disturbing the huts would block tourist access to Ramesses VI's tomb, which was a popular attraction. Carter decided popular attractions could get stuffed. He'd excavate the last unexplored patch of the valley floor, huts or no huts. On October 1st, 1922, he ordered his workers to begin clearing the site. 3 days later, they found a step. November 4th, 1922 dawned like any other working day in the Valley of the Kings, which is to say, hot, dusty, and seemingly interminable. Carter's water boy, Hussein Abd al-Rasul, arrived at the site early to fill jars from the valley supply. As he planted his water jar in the sand near where the workmen would begin, he noticed something odd. The sand sank slightly beneath the jar's weight. Hussein, who'd grown up around excavations and knew what an anomaly looked like, began playing the sand with his hands. Beneath it, cut into the bedrock, was the top of a stone step. He fetched the foreman. The foreman fetched Carter. Carter arrived to find his workers carefully clearing the sand from what was clearly a staircase cut into the rock, descending into the earth. His heart, and one imagines this is the point where even Carter's habitually dour demeanour cracked slightly, began to race. They worked with feverish care, clearing step after step. 1, 2, 5, 10. By the end of the day, they'd revealed 12 steps and the upper part of a sealed doorway, plastered over and bearing stamped seals of the royal necropolis. The jackal and 9 captives, emblem of the cemetery guards. It was a tomb. An intact, sealed tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Carter examined the door in the fading light. The seals were intact on the upper portion, which was promising. But he was also experienced enough to know that an intact door didn't guarantee an intact tomb. Ancient robbers had broken into sealed tombs, robbed them, and had the resealing done by corrupt officials. Still, the seals were there. It was something. He made a decision that must have cost him dearly. He didn't break through. Not yet. This discovery was too important, too potentially significant. Lord Carnarvon had funded this expedition, had stuck with him through 5 fruitless years. Carnarvon deserved to be present for the opening. So Carter did something that demonstrated either remarkable restraint or borderline superhuman self-control. He had the staircase refilled with rubble to protect it, posted guards, and sent a telegram to Highclere Castle. The telegram, sent November 6th, was characteristically terse. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. Wonderful discovery, magnificent tomb. The man had a gift for understatement. It's like texting someone, found something interesting in the attic, when you've discovered the Ark of the Covenant. Carnarvon in England received the telegram and immediately made arrangements to travel to Egypt. No small undertaking in 1922, involving trains, boats, and roughly 3 weeks of travel. He brought his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, who'd become as fascinated with Egypt as her father. Carter waited. For 17 days he waited, knowing that beneath tons of replaced rubble lay something sealed since antiquity. The anticipation must have been exquisite torture. like being handed a wrapped present and told you can't open it until Christmas. Except Christmas is 3 weeks away and the present might contain the archaeological find of the century. He spent the time making preparations, arranging supplies, ensuring everything would be ready for a proper excavation. He also undoubtedly worried. What if robbers had gutted the tomb in antiquity? What if it was another minor official's burial, significant but not spectacular? What if this was another of the valley's teasing near misses? Lord Carnarvon and Lady Evelyn arrived in Luxor on November 23rd. On November 24th, they re-excavated the staircase. And there, on the lower steps, previously covered by debris, they found what Carter had been unable to see during his first clearance. More seals. Seals that bore a name. Tutankhamun.
Part 3. Wonderful Things. The door opens on eternity. There's a photograph from November 26, 1922, that captures one of history's most extraordinary moments, though it was actually staged days later for the press. It shows Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon peering into a dark opening, their faces lit by flickering candlelight, gazing at something beyond the frame. Carter's expression is one of focused intensity. Carnarvon's reflects wonder tinged with disbelief. What the photograph doesn't capture is the sound, or rather, the profound silence, of 3 millennia suddenly bridged. The musty exhalation of ancient air meeting modern lungs, the psychological weight of standing at the threshold between now and then, separated by nothing more than a few feet of rubble and limestone. Or the heart-stopping terror that it might all be empty. Because here's what everyone forgets about great discoveries. Right up until the moment of revelation, failure is still the most likely outcome. Carter had been wrong before. The valley had disappointed before. History is littered with absolutely certain theories that turned out to be absolutely wrong. So let's talk about what happened when they finally broke through. After re-clearing the staircase on November 24th and confirming Tutankhamun's seals, Carter's team spent the next day removing the blocked doorway. Behind it, a rubble-filled corridor, sloping downward into darkness. 30 feet of limestone chips packed tight, back-breaking work to clear, each basket hauled up the stairs by hand. The corridor itself told a story. It had been filled deliberately in antiquity, standard practice for securing royal tombs. But Carter's trained eye noticed something troubling. Signs of ancient re-entry. A tunnel had been cut through the upper left corner of the fill, then carefully repacked. Someone had been here before. His heart sank. Robbers. The tomb had been breached. But, and this is where hope flickered back, they'd refilled it. Ancient robbers didn't tidy up after themselves unless caught and forced to by authorities. Perhaps they'd been interrupted. Perhaps they hadn't had time to strip the tomb completely. It's the archaeological equivalent of finding your house has been burgled, but the thieves apparently got spooked and left your television behind. You're still robbed, but maybe not completely robbed, which is the best you can hope for under the circumstances. By the afternoon of November 26th, they'd cleared the corridor and faced another sealed doorway. More jackal and captive seals. More evidence of ancient re-entry and re-sealing. Beyond this door, something. But what? Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner. Hot air rushed out, the tomb exhaling its ancient breath, stale and dry and heavy with the scent of resins and time. He widened the hole enough to insert a candle, testing for foul gases that might kill him, because tomb excavation in the 1920s had all the safety protocols of a Victorian chimney sweep. The candle flickered but stayed lit. The air was safe, if 3,000-year-old air can be called safe. Carter held the candle through the hole and peered in. What happened next has been told and retold so many times it's achieved mythic status. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind Carter in the narrow corridor, asked, "Can you see anything?" And Carter, his eyes adjusting to the gloom beyond, seeing the candlelight glinting off surfaces that should not be glinting after 3 millennia, replied with what might be the greatest understatement in archaeological history. Yes, wonderful things. Now, Carter later claimed he was so overwhelmed he could barely speak. Lady Evelyn Herbert, also present, despite later accounts omitting her, recalled him being struck speechless. Arthur Callender, Carter's assistant and the fourth person squeezed into that corridor, remembered stunned silence. The wonderful things exchange might be slightly embellished. Carter had a flair for the dramatic and was writing his account years later, after the discovery had become legendary. But something like it almost certainly happened, because what Carter saw through that hole defied comprehension. The room beyond, what we now know as the antechamber, was packed with objects. Not just a few items, but a chaos of treasures. Gilded couches shaped like fantastic animals, chairs and beds, alabaster vases, painted chests, chariot parts, statues, all jumbled together in what looked like the world's most valuable storage unit, abandoned mid-packing. Gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold. The tomb hadn't been emptied. It had been disturbed, yes. The disorder suggested robbers had rummaged through, but then resealed with most of its contents intact. In a valley where every other royal tomb had been comprehensively looted, where finding fragments was considered success, Carter had found a tomb that was essentially full. The four of them stood there in the flickering candlelight: Carter, Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and Callender. Understanding they were looking at something unprecedented. Not the largest tomb, not the most architecturally impressive, but intact. Intact. The only substantially undisturbed royal burial ever found in the Valley of the Kings. It was, depending on your perspective, either divine providence or Carter's bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. Possibly both. Carter, to his credit, didn't immediately swarm into the tomb like a treasure-hunting berserker. He enlarged the hole enough to squeeze through with a portable electric light, one of the era's modern conveniences that made examining the tomb infinitely easier than by candle, and conducted a preliminary examination. The antechamber measured roughly 12 by 26 feet, its walls undecorated but packed with funerary equipment. To the right, 2 life-sized statues of the king stood sentinel before a sealed doorway. That door, Carter realized with mounting excitement, likely led to the burial chamber. The mummy might still be there, undisturbed. But first, officialdom. This was 1922 Egypt, newly independent, but still navigating colonial power structures. The discovery had to be reported properly to Rex Engelbach of the Antiquities Service, permissions obtained, protocols observed. The world press was already descending. News of the find had leaked within days, and Luxor was about to experience its first media circus. On November 29th, Carter held the official opening for various dignitaries, Egyptian officials, and select press. The moment was captured on film, grainy black and white footage showing Carter in his 3-piece suit, looking like he was attending a particularly dusty business meeting rather than revealing the archaeological find of the century. There's something delightfully British about Carter's demeanour in those early photographs. No jumping up and down, no tears of joy. Just a man in a bow tie, looking mildly pleased, as if he'd found a particularly nice tea set at a jumble sale, rather than the intact tomb of a pharaoh. The official party squeezed into the antechamber, and one can only imagine the chaos. Egyptian officials in their fezzes, British dignitaries in suits utterly inappropriate for valley heat, everyone trying not to knock over 3,000-year-old artifacts while gawking at the treasures. Arthur Nace, an archaeologist from the Metropolitan Museum of Art who'd come to assist Carter, described the scene. The effect was bewildering, overwhelming. I suppose most excavators would confess to a feeling of awe, embarrassment almost, when they break into a chamber closed and sealed by pious hands so many centuries ago. But Carter had no time for awe-struck paralysis. There was work to do. Enormous, painstaking, precedent-setting work. Here's where Carter's years of training under Flinders Petrie paid dividends. A lesser archaeologist might have rushed to the burial chamber, torn through to the mummy, grabbed the gold mask, and called it a day. Carter understood that every object in that tomb told a story, and removing them without proper documentation would destroy invaluable information. He assembled a team of specialists. Harry Burton, a photographer from the Metropolitan Museum, whose images would become iconic. Alfred Lucas, a chemist, to handle conservation. Arthur Mace for excavation assistance. Numerous Egyptian conservators, artists, and workers whose names were often omitted from Western accounts, but who did much of the actual labor. Burton's photography alone was revolutionary. He didn't just snap pictures. He created a comprehensive visual record using large format glass plate negatives, carefully lit scenes, and multiple angles. His images remain the gold standard for archaeological photography. Crisp, detailed, beautifully composed. Every object had to be photographed in situ before being moved, then drawn and catalogued, then carefully conserved. Many items were fragile after millennia, their wood dried, their fabrics delicate, their glues and resins degraded, then packed for transport to the Cairo Museum. The antechamber alone contained over 600 objects. Carter estimated it would take weeks to clear. It took nearly 8 months. 8 months of painstaking work in sweltering heat, with the world press camped outside demanding updates, with tourists trying to bribe their way in, with Egyptian and British officials jockeying for control, with academic rivals circling like vultures, and with the growing realization that beyond that sealed doorway, guarded by the sentinel statues, lay the burial chamber itself. The pressure was immense. Carter's perfectionism made him difficult to work with. He snapped at assistants, quarreled with officials, and treated interruptions with the warmth of a hibernating bear poked with a stick. But the work was exemplary. Every basket of artifacts removed from that tomb was properly recorded, conserved, and catalogued. Well, almost every basket. But we'll get to the theft accusations later. By February 1923, the antechamber was finally cleared enough to approach the sealed doorway between the sentinel statues. Carter assembled another official party, this time with even more dignitaries, because apparently ancient Egypt wasn't complicated enough without adding modern bureaucracy. On February 17, 1923, Carter began dismantling the sealed doorway. Behind it lay not the burial chamber, but another room, the annex, even more chaotically packed with objects tumbled in disorder. But beyond a short corridor, another sealed door beckoned. Carter broke through. The burial chamber. Unlike the antechamber, this room's walls were decorated. Golden yellow paintings showing Tutankhamun with various gods, religious scenes ensuring his safe passage to the afterlife. The art was beautiful, if hastily executed, suggesting the tomb's decoration had been rushed. But dominating the chamber, filling nearly the entire space, was a wall of gold. A giant gilded shrine, its surface gleaming with protective spells and religious texts, stood nearly wall to wall. Inside that shrine, as they would discover over the following months, was another shrine. And inside that, another, and another. 4 nested shrines in total, like the world's most expensive Matryoshka dolls, protecting the stone sarcophagus within. And inside the sarcophagus, presumably, lay Tutankhamun himself. Carter stood there, calculating the time and effort required to dismantle 4 massive shrines in a space so tight he could barely squeeze between shrine and wall. and probably experienced the unique exhaustion of realizing you've solved one problem only to discover 7 more hiding behind it. It's rather like opening a long-awaited package only to find it contains another package, which contains another package, which contains a note saying, "Some assembly required." But Carter had come this far. 5 years searching. 3 months clearing the antechamber. He wasn't stopping now. Though, as it turned out, he'd have to. Because the 1923 season was ending, and the work couldn't be rushed. The shrines would have to wait until autumn. Tutankhamun had waited 3,000 years. A few more months wouldn't kill him. He was, after all, already quite thoroughly dead. As Carter sealed the tomb for the summer, leaving guards posted and the burial chamber tantalizingly unopened, the world's fascination reached fever pitch. Newspapers ran daily updates. Tut mania gripped the public imagination. Fashion designers incorporated Egyptian motifs. Architecture embraced Art Deco's Egyptian influences. And in the sealed darkness beneath the valley floor, a boy king lay in his nested golden shrines, waiting for the autumn, when Howard Carter would finally look upon the face that had been hidden for over 3 millennia. But first, Carter had to survive the politics, the press, and his own increasingly difficult personality. Part 4. The Mummy Revealed. Unwrapping Eternity. There's something uniquely macabre about the act of unwrapping a mummy. You're essentially undressing a corpse that's been lying in the dark for 3,000 years, preserved by natron salts and religious conviction, all while a committee of scientists, officials, and curious onlookers watches like it's a particularly morbid theatre performance. And yet, this is precisely what Howard Carter prepared to do in the autumn of 1923, after spending the summer months being driven slowly mad by bureaucracy, press inquiries, and the knowledge that Tutankhamun's actual body still lay waiting beneath those nested golden shrines. The world wanted answers. Carter wanted answers. And Tutankhamun, presumably, wanted to be left alone. But nobody was asking him. So let's talk about what happened when they finally reached the boy king himself. When Carter returned to the valley in October 1923 for the second season, he faced a logistical nightmare that would make modern project managers weep. The burial chamber measured roughly 13 by 11 feet. The outermost shrine measured 17 by 11 feet. Do the math, and you'll realize Carter had approximately 6 inches of clearance on some sides, barely enough to squeeze through sideways, let alone maneuver massive gilded wooden panels weighing hundreds of pounds. The shrines weren't just decorative boxes. They were intricate wooden structures covered in gold leaf, inscribed with religious texts from the Book of the Dead, fitted together with ancient carpentry techniques that had survived millennia. Dismantling them required the patience of a bomb disposal expert and the spatial reasoning skills of someone solving a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle in a closet. Carter and his team worked in sweltering conditions. Winter in the Valley of the Kings is merely hot rather than surface of the sun, carefully photographing, documenting, and removing each panel. The outermost shrine came apart in sections. Inside it, another shrine, this one sealed with intact clay seals bearing Tutankhamun's cartouche and the necropolis stamp. Those seals were significant. They proved no one had breached the inner shrines since 1323 BCE, which meant that whatever lay inside had been undisturbed for 3,245 years. The ancient robbers who'd ransacked the antechamber had apparently looked at the burial chamber, decided dismantling 4 massive shrines was too much like hard work, and settled for grabbing the easier portable goods instead. Lazy criminals, making archaeologists' jobs easier since the Bronze Age. Inside the second shrine, a third shrine, even more elaborately decorated. Inside that, a fourth and final shrine, its doors sealed with a bolt still wrapped in ancient cord. Carter photographed it, hands probably trembling slightly, before drawing back the bolt. The first person to touch it since Tutankhamun's priests had secured it over 3 millennia ago. The doors swung open to reveal a massive stone sarcophagus, carved from a single block of yellow quartzite, its corners protected by goddesses with outstretched wings. The lid, made of rose granite, a different stone, suggesting hasty substitution when the intended lid wasn't ready, weighed over a ton. February 1924. Carter assembled lifting equipment and another audience of officials. With ropes, pulleys, and collective held breath, they raised the lid. Inside the sarcophagus lay a coffin, anthropoid in shape, depicting Tutankhamun in the regalia of Osiris, god of the afterlife, arms crossed holding the crook and flail of kingship. It was covered in gold leaf and inlaid with coloured glass and semi-precious stones. They lifted it out. 7 feet long, remarkably heavy, beautiful. The coffin lid came off to reveal another coffin inside. Because apparently ancient Egyptian funerary practices operated on the principle that if some protection is good, absurd amounts of protection are better. The second coffin was even more spectacular. More intricate inlays, more detailed craftsmanship. They lifted its lid. Third coffin. This one different, heavier, much heavier. The third coffin, as Carter discovered with mounting astonishment, wasn't wood covered in gold leaf. It was solid gold. Over 200 pounds of pure gold, fashioned into a coffin depicting the young king in exquisite detail. The value was astronomical, the artistic achievement priceless. But inside this final golden shell lay what they'd been seeking all along, the mummy of Tutankhamun himself. Well, theoretically, because what they actually found was a mummy-shaped object stuck fast to the coffin by hardened unguents, resins and oils that had been poured over the body during burial and had, over 3 millennia, essentially welded the mummy to its golden container, like the world's most valuable epoxy disaster. Carter faced a conservation nightmare. The traditional method of unwrapping mummies, slowly, carefully, layer by layer, wasn't possible when the mummy was cemented to a solid gold coffin. They tried heating the coffin in the Egyptian sun to soften the resins. The resins, having had 3,000 years to achieve peak stubbornness, declined to cooperate. Eventually, Carter made the difficult decision to unwrap the mummy in situ, cutting through the hardened unguents to separate body from coffin. It was archaeologically necessary, but hardly ideal. Dr. Douglas Derry, an anatomist from Cairo, led the unwrapping on November 11, 1925, 3 years after the tomb's discovery. What they found was heartbreaking and fascinating in equal measure. The mummy was in poor condition compared to other royal mummies. The excessive unguents had essentially charred the outer layers of wrappings and skin. But as they carefully unwrapped layer after layer of linen, removing the 143 amulets and pieces of jewelry that had been tucked between the wrappings for magical protection, they began to piece together the story of the boy beneath the gold. He had been young, very young. Initial examination suggested late teens, 17 to 19 years old. He'd stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, slight of build. His skull showed he'd had a somewhat elongated cranium, possibly a family trait inherited from his father Akhenaten, whose artistic depictions showed similar features. X-rays taken later would reveal a fragment of bone in his skull, evidence of trauma, though whether from a fatal blow or post-mortem damage during mummification remained debated. His left foot showed signs of necrosis, dead tissue, possibly from a broken bone that had become infected. Combined with a curved spine and other skeletal anomalies, the medical evidence painted a picture of a young man whose body had not been kind to him, who'd likely walked with a limp, and who died suddenly enough that his tomb, clearly intended for someone else, had to be hastily repurposed. The romantic image of the powerful pharaoh dissolved into something more human. A teenager with health problems, thrust into kingship as a child, dead before he could grow a proper beard, buried with hasty honors and extravagant goods to ensure his afterlife compensated for a rather difficult mortal existence. But before they'd reached the mummy itself, Carter had found the single most iconic artifact from the tomb, the golden funerary mask. It had covered Tutankhamun's head and shoulders, fitted directly over the wrapped mummy. 24 pounds of solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, obsidian, and coloured glass. The face, idealized, serene, eternally youthful, stared upward with inlaid eyes that seemed to hold depth and life, despite being made of quartz and obsidian. The craftsmanship was breathtaking, every detail perfect. The royal headdress with its cobra and vulture protectors, the braided false beard of divinity, the inlaid collar depicting protective deities. The back was inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, ensuring the king's transformation into an eternal being. That mask has become one of the most recognizable objects in human history, more famous than Tutankhamun himself ever was in life, more iconic than most living celebrities, reproduced on everything from museum posters to refrigerator magnets. It's the face people imagine when they think ancient Egypt, despite representing a minor king who reigned briefly and accomplished relatively little. There's a peculiar irony in that. Tutankhamun's successors tried to erase him from history. They succeeded so well that he was forgotten for 3 millennia. And then, Carter's stubbornness gave him an immortality far beyond what his actual reign ever warranted. The pharaoh who was meant to disappear became the most famous of them all. By the time Carter had fully cleared the burial chamber, documented every artifact, and examined the mummy, years had passed. The work was exhausting, meticulous, and increasingly fraught with complications that had nothing to do with archaeology. The Egyptian government, flexing its post-independence authority, was asserting control over excavations and artifacts with increasing firmness. Nationalist sentiment held that Egypt's treasures belonged in Egypt, not shipped to British museums. Carter's agreement with Carnarvon included provisions for sharing fines, standard practice in the colonial era, increasingly unacceptable in the new political reality. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the political battles reached their peak, before the question of who owned Tutankhamun's legacy could be fully fought, tragedy struck. Lord Carnarvon, who'd funded Carter's obsession for years, who'd been present for the tomb's opening, who'd stood beside Carter in those first, breathless moments of discovery, fell ill in Cairo in March 1923, just weeks after the official opening of the burial chamber. A mosquito bite on his cheek had become infected. He'd nicked it while shaving, and in an era before antibiotics, the infection spiraled into blood poisoning. On April 5, 1923, with his son at his bedside, Lord Carnarvon died. He was 56 years old. He'd waited years to find Tutankhamun. He'd lived just long enough to glimpse the burial chamber, but died before the mummy was unwrapped, before the greatest treasures were revealed. And the press, smelling a story far more sensational than mere archaeology, pounced on a narrative that would haunt the discovery forever. The curse of the pharaoh. Part 5. Curses and Consequences, when the dead fight back. Let's be absolutely clear about something. There was no curse. No ancient Egyptian priest carved warnings about disturbing Tutankhamun's rest. No hieroglyphic text threatened death to tomb violators. The famous Curse of the Pharaohs was a fiction, invented by journalists with deadlines and a public hungry for supernatural thrills in an age caught between scientific rationalism and spiritual yearning. But facts have never been particularly effective at killing a good story, and Lord Carnarvon's death, occurring mere months after opening the tomb, was too narratively perfect for the press to resist. They ran with it like Olympic sprinters, and King Tut's curse became the biggest supernatural story of the 1920s, competing with seances, spiritualism, and Houdini's crusade against fraudulent mediums for the public's paranoid attention. The timing was, admittedly, rather suspicious from a storytelling perspective. If you were writing fiction, you couldn't have scripted it better. Wealthy lord funds expedition, discovers intact tomb, dies mysteriously within months. It's practically begging for a curse narrative. The fact that he died from an infected mosquito bite, about as mundane as death gets in 1920s Egypt, was far less interesting than ancient vengeance from beyond the grave. The curse story gained traction through a combination of journalistic invention, public credulity, and some genuinely weird coincidences. Newspapers reported that the lights in Cairo went out the moment Carnarvon died. They did. Cairo's electrical grid was notoriously unreliable. They claimed his dog in England howled and died at the same moment. Unverifiable, but great copy. One particularly creative journalist invented an inscription that supposedly appeared on the tomb's entrance. "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." No such inscription existed. Carter repeatedly, wearily, debunked the curse claims. But denying a curse is rather like denying you're a witch during a witch trial. The denial itself becomes suspicious. Why would he deny it unless he was worried about it? Other deaths followed, each breathlessly reported as further evidence. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, an Egyptian prince present at the opening, was shot by his wife in a London hotel months later, a crime of passion having absolutely nothing to do with ancient curses, but details. George J. Gould, an American financier who visited the tomb, died of pneumonia shortly after. He was also 58, with pre-existing health issues, but again, details. Arthur Mace, Carter's assistant, died in 1928 from chronic illnesses he'd suffered for years before the tomb's discovery. The press kept a running tally of curse victims, conveniently ignoring the far longer list of people intimately involved with the tomb who lived to ripe old ages. Carter himself survived until 1939, 17 years post-discovery, dying at age 64 from lymphoma, which is tragic but hardly supernatural. Harry Burton, the photographer who spent more time in the tomb than almost anyone, lived until 1940. Dr. Derry, who actually unwrapped the mummy and handled the body directly, died in 1961 at age 87. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's daughter and one of the first to enter the tomb, lived until 1980, dying at age 79 after a full life completely untroubled by vengeful pharaohs. But facts, as mentioned, are boring. Curses are exciting. The real curse afflicting the Tutankhamun discovery wasn't supernatural, it was political. And it came from the very much alive Egyptian government rather than the long-dead king. By 1924, Egypt's nationalist movement had strengthened considerably. The Wafd Party, leading the independence movement, had won elections. Egyptians increasingly resented foreign archaeologists treating their country as a personal antiquities shop, removing treasures to European museums, while Egyptian institutions received, at best, leftovers. Carter's agreement with the Egyptian government allowed him to excavate, but ownership of finds was contested. The standard colonial-era practice of splitting finds between the excavator and Egypt was becoming politically untenable. Egyptian officials insisted all Tutankhamun artifacts remain in Egypt. Reasonable, given they came from an Egyptian tomb and represented Egyptian heritage, but financially devastating to those who'd invested years and fortunes in the work. It's a bit awkward to argue, but we found it so we should get to keep some, when what you found was literally the preserved body of someone else's ancestor, surrounded by their cultural treasures. Carter and the British authorities tried anyway, because imperialism dies hard, and with considerable complaining. Tensions exploded in February 1924. Carter, displaying his characteristic diplomatic skills, which is to say, none whatsoever, locked out Egyptian officials from the tomb during a visit by officials' wives. The Egyptian government, unimpressed by this tantrum, revoked his excavation authorization entirely. For nearly 2 years, Carter was banned from the tomb he'd discovered. The Egyptian government took control, posted guards, and Carter could only watch from the outside as political negotiations dragged on. He'd spent 5 years searching, 3 years excavating, and now couldn't access his own discovery because he'd chosen the worst possible moment to have a row with the people who actually, legally, owned the tomb. The dispute was eventually resolved through compromise and Carter's grudging apologies, but the damage to relationships was permanent. The collaborative spirit of early excavation seasons soured into mutual suspicion and resentment. While newspapers obsessed over curses and politicians fought over ownership, the actual work continued. Carter spent a decade, 1922 to 1932, completely clearing the tomb. 10 years to document, conserve, and remove approximately 5,398 objects, from massive shrines to tiny beads, each requiring photography, cataloguing, and careful preservation. The objects told stories. The tomb contained 2 tiny mummified fetuses, likely Tutankhamun's stillborn children, daughters who would have continued his bloodline had they lived. Their presence was heartbreaking. A young king who died without heirs, whose genetic line ended with him, leaving Egypt to be ruled by his elderly advisor Ai, and later the general Horemheb, who would systematically erase the Amarna period from official records. The tomb's hasty preparation was evident everywhere. Wall paintings in the burial chamber were beautiful but rushed, still showing the artist's preliminary sketches beneath the paint. The tomb itself was small, intended for a nobleman, not a king, repurposed when Tutankhamun died unexpectedly young. The outer coffins bore evidence of name changes, suggesting they'd been made for someone else, possibly Akhenaten's immediate successor, and modified for Tut. What emerged was a picture not of a powerful pharaoh, but of a brief, troubled life. A boy made king at 9 in the aftermath of his father's religious revolution, married to his half-sister Antechamber in a desperate attempt to legitimize the royal line, presiding over the restoration of traditional gods his father had banned, dying at roughly 18 without surviving children, buried with immense wealth but in a tomb too small for his status. The treasures were spectacular, yes, but they were also compensation, an afterlife of gold and plenty to make up for a mortal existence that had been, by most measures, rather difficult. And now, 3,000 years later, his name was known worldwide. His face, or rather, the idealized gold face that covered his mummy, was instantly recognizable. Museums fought to host traveling exhibitions of his treasures. He'd become far more famous in death than he ever was in life. The curse, if there was one, wasn't death. It was fame. Eternal, inescapable fame, denying him the peaceful obscurity his successors had intended.
Part 6. Golden Splendor. The Treasures and Their Secret. Here's a fun thought experiment. Imagine you're an ancient Egyptian pharaoh's funeral planner, and your 9-year-old boss has just died unexpectedly at 18. You've got approximately 70 days, the length of the mummification process, to prepare everything he'll need for eternity. No pressure, but if you mess this up, the king's afterlife is ruined, and you'll probably be executed. So you'd better pack literally everything, and I do mean everything.
The tomb of Tutankhamun contained more than 5,000 individual objects, ranging from priceless masterworks of ancient art to, why on earth did they include this? It was part treasury, part storage unit, part time capsule, and part extremely expensive garage sale that nobody was meant to attend for all eternity. Carter found 6 chariots, because apparently the afterlife has traffic, 130 walking sticks. Tut's foot problems meant he needed mobility aids, but 130 seems excessive, even for eternity. 50 garments, multiple beds, chairs, games, musical instruments, and enough food and wine to stock a decent restaurant. There were also 413 shaptis, magical servant figurines meant to do agricultural work in the afterlife, because even in paradise, someone's got to do the farming, and pharaohs don't do manual labor. Let's explore what these objects actually tell us. We've already mentioned the golden mask, 24 pounds of pure gold, inlaid with semi-precious stones, one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements, and the face that launched 1,000 museum gift shops. But let's talk about what makes it remarkable beyond the obvious, it's made of gold and gorgeous factor. The mask wasn't just decorative, it was transformative. Ancient Egyptians believed the Ka, life force, and Ba, personality/soul, needed to recognize the body to reunite with it in the afterlife. The mask provided an idealized, eternal face, forever young, forever divine, forever Tutankhamun. The realistic mummy beneath might decay, but this golden version would last forever. The attention to detail is extraordinary. Individual strands of the braided false beard rendered in gold, the vulture and cobra on the forehead, representing Upper and Lower Egypt, inlaid with hundreds of tiny pieces, the eyes made of quartz and obsidian with actual depth and life to them. Someone spent months, possibly years, crafting this mask for a king who'd barely lived long enough to need a proper shaving kit. The 3 nested coffins were similarly excessive. The outer 2 were gilded wood, already extravagant, but that innermost solid gold coffin, weighing over 240 pounds, represented wealth almost beyond comprehension. At today's gold prices, the metal alone would be worth over $4 million, never mind the historical and artistic value. For comparison, that's enough gold to make roughly 12,000 wedding rings, which seems like an inefficient use of resources for one dead teenager, but ancient Egyptians didn't do things by halves. Evidence suggests the middle coffin was originally made for someone else, possibly Nefertiti or Smenkhkare, Akhenaten's co-regent, and hastily modified for Tut. The cartouches, name rings, show signs of alteration, and the face has suspiciously feminine features. This supports the theory that Tut's death was unexpected, and his burial assembled from whatever was available, like preparing a state dinner using only what's currently in your fridge. Beyond the gold and grandeur, the tomb contained fascinatingly mundane objects that humanized the ancient king. There were board games, Senet and 20 squares, which Tut had presumably played in life and expected to enjoy in death, because eternity without entertainment sounds dreadful, even if you're a god king. The walking sticks weren't just ceremonial. Analysis showed many bore wear marks from actual use. Tut genuinely needed them. His mummy's left foot showed necrosis, his spine had curvature issues, and genetic analysis, done much later, revealed he had Kohler disease, a bone disorder. The powerful warrior king imagery was propaganda. The reality was a limping teenager with chronic pain, doing his best with a body that wasn't cooperating. There were also 2 trumpets, one silver, one copper and gold, which remained playable after 3,000 years. In 1939, BBC broadcast one being played, and it produced an eerie, haunting sound that probably wasn't improved by millennia of aging. The trumpeter allegedly fainted afterward, which the press naturally attributed to the curse, rather than, say, blowing into a 3,000-year-old tube that had been sealed in a tomb and probably contained the ancient equivalent of toxic mold spores. The tomb included elaborate fans made of ostrich feathers, long since disintegrated, cosmetic implements, jewelry, and multiple shabti boxes. There were oils, unguents, and perfumes that had long since solidified into sticky black resins. Carter found leftover funeral feast food, desiccated but identifiable, still sitting on offering tables. Someone had left the king bread, meat, and wine for his journey, and there it had sat for over 3 millennia, the saddest packed lunch in history. 2 mummified fetuses, genetic analysis later confirmed they were Tutankhamun's daughters, both stillborn or dying shortly after birth, were stored in tiny coffins. They represented not just personal tragedy, but dynastic catastrophe. Tut's bloodline died with him. His widow, Antechamber, disappeared from records shortly after his death, possibly forced to marry the elderly advisor Ai to legitimize his claim to the throne. It's Game of Thrones-level political maneuvering, except with more mummification and fewer dragons. The tomb's small size and hasty decoration told their own story. KV-62, its official designation, King's Valley Tomb 62, had 4 small chambers totaling roughly 110 square meters. Compare that to Seti I's tomb at over 400 square meters, or the massive complexes intended for long-reigning pharaohs. Tut got a nobleman's tomb, upgraded in a hurry. The burial chamber's paintings, while beautiful, showed signs of rush work. Artists had sketched preliminary drawings directly on the plastered walls, then painted over them, but in some places, the sketches showed through. Normally, such work would be refined, corrected, perfected. These paintings were functional rather than flawless, painted by skilled artists working against a deadline measured in days, not years. It's the ancient equivalent of submitting homework that's technically complete, but definitely could have used another proofreading pass. Yes, the pharaoh is depicted communing with the gods, and yes, we finished before the burial. And no, we didn't have time to fix that weird hand angle on Osiris. He's been dead for millions of years. He probably won't complain about artistic liberties. The annex, discovered last, smaller than the antechamber, packed chaotically with objects tumbled in disorder, contained more mundane items: jars, boxes, furniture stacked haphazardly. Ancient robbers had clearly rummaged through it, looking for easily portable valuables. They'd left the heavy stuff, grabbed gold and oils, valuable commodities, and fled before being caught. The authorities had then shoved everything back in without much organization and resealed the tomb. So when Carter found it, he discovered a pharaoh's burial that was simultaneously the most intact royal tomb ever found and the victim of ancient burglary. It was both pristine and ransacked, a contradiction that somehow made it more fascinating. Taken together, the treasures revealed not just wealth, but world view. Ancient Egyptians approached death not as an ending, but as a transition requiring extensive preparation. Tut's afterlife would mirror his earthly existence. He'd need chariots for hunting, games for entertainment, food for sustenance, servants, via shabtis, for labor, and protective amulets for safety. The sheer quantity of gold demonstrated religious conviction as much as wealth. Gold was the flesh of the gods, imperishable and eternal. Covering Tutankhamun in gold transformed him from mortal king to divine being, ensuring his continuation forever. But there was also tenderness in these objects. Someone had carefully packed his childhood toys. Someone had included a lock of his grandmother's hair in a tiny coffin, labelled with her name. Someone had ensured his stillborn daughters accompanied him, so he wouldn't be alone. The tomb wasn't just a treasure hoard. It was a love letter to a boy who died too young, from a court trying to ensure his eternity was better than his mortality. And now, Those objects sit in climate-controlled museum cases, visited by millions, photographed endlessly, studied by scholars, reproduced on merchandise. They've achieved a kind of immortality the ancient Egyptians intended, just not in the way they imagined. Tutankhamun's afterlife isn't in the field of reeds with Osiris. It's in museums, textbooks, and documentaries. Which brings us to the question of what happens to these treasures now, and who really owns the legacy of a boy king. Part 7. Legacy and Echoes. The Boy King's Eternal Afterlife. In 1939, Howard Carter died in his London apartment at age 64. There was no state funeral, no grand memorial. The man who'd made the most spectacular archaeological discovery of the 20th century passed away relatively quietly. His death noted, but not mourned with the fanfare you'd expect for someone who'd given the world Tutankhamun. He died of lymphoma, completely uncursed, despite spending a decade breathing tomb dust and handling ancient artifacts. His funeral was small. He was buried in Putney Vale Cemetery, his gravestone modest. For years, his grave was neglected, overgrown with weeds, a rather anticlimactic end for someone who'd spent his life obsessed with proper burial and eternal remembrance. The irony is almost painful. Carter had devoted his career to ensuring a dead teenager received proper scholarly attention, carefully cataloguing every bead from Tut's tomb. His own legacy was a cluttered apartment, and colleagues who remembered him as brilliant but difficult. History has a dark sense of humor. The 1920s didn't just discover Tutankhamun, they became obsessed. Tutmania swept the Western world, influencing everything from fashion to architecture in ways both sublime and deeply silly. Art Deco absorbed Egyptian motifs with enthusiastic abandon. Buildings sprouted lotus columns. The Chrysler Building featured Egyptian-inspired elements. Movie palaces went full pharaoh. Fashion designers created dresses with lotus petal hems, gold lame mimicking tomb gold, and jewelry featuring scarabs and ankhs. Women styled their bobbed hair to evoke Egyptian wigs. Suddenly, everyone wanted to look like they'd stepped out of a 3,000-year-old tomb. Cosmetics companies created Pharaohs Rouge. You could buy King Tut brand lemons, cotton, even a racehorse named after him. There was King Tut sheet music, a novelty song that became a hit, and countless pop culture references. This served a purpose beyond trendiness. The 1920s were rebuilding after unprecedented trauma. World War I, Spanish flu, millions dead. The world needed magic, and a golden boy king who'd waited 3 millennia to be found provided exactly that. A story about discovery rather than destruction, about beauty surviving impossible spans of time. Carter's work continued until 1932, 10 years of meticulous documentation setting new standards for archaeological practice, even as it operated under colonial assumptions about who owned the past. Every object was photographed by Harry Burton, catalogued by Carter, conserved by specialists, and transported to the Cairo Museum. The thoroughness was groundbreaking. Carter's notes and Burton's photographs created records that remain invaluable. But Carter's relationship with Egyptian authorities never recovered from the 1924 dispute. Final seasons were marked by tension and his increasing isolation. When work concluded in 1932, Carter was 58, exhausted, essentially done with archaeology. He spent remaining years writing up findings, giving occasional lectures, dealing with his reputation as difficult. He never married, remained socially awkward, preferred cats to people. He'd given everything to archaeology, his health, relationships, entire adult life. He'd made the discovery that would define Egyptian archaeology forever. Yet he died relatively alone, recognized but not beloved. Today, Tutankhamun's legacy raises uncomfortable questions about archaeology, colonialism, and cultural heritage. Who owns the past? Who has the right to excavate and display ancient artifacts? Carter operated when Western archaeologists assumed the right to excavate anywhere their empires reached, removing artifacts to European museums as standard practice. The assumption was paternalistic, saving treasures from neglect, making them accessible to scholars. But whose humanity? Who decides? Modern Egypt increasingly demands return of artifacts in Western museums. The debate over Tutankhamun's treasures, all of which remained in Egypt, is less contentious than disputes over the Rosetta Stone or Nefertiti's bust. But the principle remains. Should Egyptian heritage reside in Egypt, or is it world heritage to distribute globally? There's no easy answer. The Grand Egyptian Museum now displays all 5,000 plus Tutankhamun objects together for the first time since antiquity. It's spectacular, and it's in Egypt, which feels right. But would Carter's discovery have happened without British colonial infrastructure? Would artifacts have been as carefully conserved without his international team? Would global fascination have reached the same heights without international touring exhibitions? Carter was both, a serious archaeologist who revolutionized methods, and a participant in colonial systems, assuming European entitlement to other cultures' heritage. He can be both simultaneously. History is complicated. So what is Tutankhamun's legacy? He was a minor king who accomplished little, dying too young to make historical impact. His successors tried erasing him and nearly succeeded. By rights, he should be a footnote. Instead, he's the most famous pharaoh in history. His golden mask is instantly recognizable worldwide. More people know Tutankhamun than Ramesses II, who reigned 66 years, or Thutmose III, who conquered an empire. Why? Because Carter was stubborn enough to keep digging when everyone said the valley was exhausted. Because Carnarvon funded that stubborn search. Because skilled teams documented everything meticulously. Because the 1920s world was hungry for wonder. Tutankhamun's real curse wasn't death. It was fame. Eternal, inescapable fame. His afterlife isn't peaceful eternity sailing with Ra. It's museum cases, tourist photography, DNA analysis. His mummy has been CT scanned, X-rayed, genetically sequenced, displayed in climate-controlled glass. He wanted to rest in peace. Instead, he became the world's most famous dead teenager. But perhaps there's something fitting. Ancient Egyptians believed saying someone's name kept them alive in memory. Tutankhamun's name is spoken millions of times daily. By that measure, he's achieved the immortality his culture prized. Just not in the way anyone expected. On quiet mornings in the Valley of the Kings, before tour buses arrive, you can stand at KV 62's entrance and imagine November 1922. The anticipation. Carter's trembling hand holding the candle. Carnarvon asking, "Can you see anything?" Yes, wonderful things. A golden mask that captured the world's imagination. A boy king pulled from obscurity into unprecedented fame. Archaeological methods that set standards still followed. A story of persistence, obsession, and our need to connect with distant pasts. Carter gave Tutankhamun a second life, not the eternal divine existence ancient Egyptians intended, but cultural immortality. The boy who died at 18, whose name was erased, whose accomplishments were minimal, has now outlived his erasers. Both Carter and Tutankhamun achieved immortality neither probably wanted. The obsessive, difficult archaeologist who couldn't get along with people. The sickly boy king who never grew old. Together, they created a discovery transcending both their lives, becoming a story about human curiosity, the depths of time, and our endless fascination with those who came before. The valley keeps its remaining secrets, but thanks to Carter's stubbornness and Tutankhamun's accidental fame, we know that beneath sand and stone and silence, incredible things wait. Sometimes you just need someone stubborn enough to keep digging. And on that note, dear listeners, if you've made it this far without drifting off, congratulations. If you fell asleep around part 3, well, that's precisely what this was for. You've now spent hours with dead pharaohs, difficult archaeologists, and the peculiar intersection of colonial archaeology and ancient magic.
Sweet dreams. May your sleep be as undisturbed as Tutankhamun's was for 3,000 years, though preferably with fewer unguents. Good night.